I like, Julie, that you said we're in Ta'anit still, because we're actually in a run right now of Masechtot that are a lot shorter, right? Masechet Shabbat was months and months and months. Like each Masechet now at the end of the Seder is closer to 30 pages, and it's about a month per Masechet. So I'm actually feeling like, oh my God, it's a new Masechet, it's a new Masechet, it's a new Masechet, that the pace is picked up and the topics change. For those of you who like change, that's probably good. New topics each time. And for those who like to sit and dwell longer over something, well, guess what? Soon there will be a new Seder and there'll be some longer Masechtot on the way. Good morning, everybody from all over North America, and at least Dallas, Fort Worth, Seattle, Mount Kisco, and Riverdale. I'm gonna stop reading the hellos now because we could spend all our half hour just on hello and where we're from. We are in the middle of Masechet Ta'anit. And Masechet Ta'anit, if you've been reading or attending these weekly sessions, as you may know, is about the procedure that the rabbis set up for communal fasts. And the communal fast days were called in the face of communal suffering that came from either drought, right, lack of rain, which is common in Israel, or also disease or warfare or other sorts of things. We're gonna dig into a few specific things today. But I think the overall theme that I have today is that came to mind as I was picking from the rich texts of this week for what we were going to look at this week, is to think about what are some of the things that these texts might have to say for us today. Because we look at the world in some ways influenced by the rabbinic lens, and in some ways living a couple millennia later, we look at the world differently from the rabbis. But it struck me that we're at a time where the world is facing disease that would be fast-worthy for the rabbis of the Talmud. I think if these were Talmudic times, there would be public fasts in response to the COVID pandemic. And also in terms of the calamities we're facing in terms of climate change, it's not only drought that is causing strife for human populations across the globe. Sometimes it's too much rain, but all the different climate changes are affecting us, that there would be a good case to call for public fasts for the changing climate and how it's affecting our civilization as well. And so I have those things in mind as I introduce the first set of texts from the pages. And at the end, I'm going to shift to a second set of texts that has a connection more to Hanukkah, because Daf Yomi doesn't always line up with the Jewish calendar, but this week it did a little bit. So we're going to look at a text that connects them to Hanukkah at the end, that also might have something to say about today as well. So anyways, thanks for being here. I so love that so many people are connected to Daf Yomi and our study together and join in this space. And I'm going to jump in. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So the text that we're going to look at right now have to do with some of the steps in the process of what happens on a public fast. Because during a public fast, when the rabbis decree a fast, there's a traditional tefillah service, right? There's a prayer service that looks like daily tefillah with a few extra prayers that Masechet Ta'anit goes into as well. But they change the venue and do a few other changes to the ritual, and that's some of what we're going to look at right now. So the first text I have up on the screen right now, the Mishnah had said that there's a move of the public prayer from inside the synagogue to the public square. And the Gemara asks the question, why do they go out into the public square? And a number of rabbis answered the question, but I picked for us the answer of Rabbi Elliot bar Abba, who says, this is a symbolic action, as though to say, right, we cried out in private inside the synagogue, and we were not answered. We will therefore disgrace ourselves in public so that our prayers will be heard. It's the notion behind this is that, right, the prayers that we're making inside our synagogues, in the comforts of our homes or in the comforts of our community places where we usually gather, it seems that if the drought has not ended, if the disease has not dissipated, our prayers to end these calamities that we face have not been heard, and the rabbis want to take more drastic notions. And somehow taking the service outside to them seems to be some form of public disgrace, some form of showing our humility or our sorrow or our repentance, and in hopes that if we go out into the streets to pray, that maybe our prayers will be heard. So that's shift number one the rabbis make. Shift number two is not only does the prayer space move into the, oh, hang on, let me do this. I can make the screen bigger for you guys by closing my toolbar. Sorry for the technology moment. I'm just a guest in the 21st century. I'm from the 20th century, and while I like these 21st century tools, there we go. Maybe we can make it a little bigger. Get rid of. All right, I'm back to the Talmud. Sorry. So not only do the people go to the streets to pray, we also move the ark. Right. We also take the accoutrements of the synagogues, right, of our service, and we bring them out with us. And the Talmud asks also, why do we remove the ark to the city square? And here's an answer to that from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. He says, this is done as though to say, we have a modest vessel which we always kept concealed, but it's been publicly exposed due to our transgressions. Some more rabbinic theology behind that, right? What does he say? We have a modest vessel, the Torah. We keep the Torah concealed, not necessarily, right? There's a sense of hiddenness, but also a sense that we protect the Torah. We keep it inside. We keep it in the ark. That's my favorite rabbi pun joke, right? Why do we keep a Torah inside an ark? It makes it a safer Torah. All right, some of you might get that or not, right? Sefer Torah in Hebrew is like a Torah scroll, but safer, it's also, safer, like safety, security. My children love the rabbi jokes. But there's a sense of that where we keep the Torah safe inside the synagogue and inside the ark. And we keep it private and it's to ourselves. But if we're facing drought, if we're facing disease, if we're facing calamity, the rabbinic theological sense is we've done something wrong and God is punishing us. And that somehow exposes our transgressions and our failure to hold up to our contract with God, which is written in the Torah. And since our failure has been publicized, we take the Torah out from our private spaces and into the public spaces as we pray for the end to the calamity that we're facing. Third related text, another thing we do while the Torah and the ark are moved outside, we actually put ashes on top of the ark. And the rabbis ask, why do we place burnt ashes on top of the ark? And Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi says, this is as though to say in God's name, he quotes from Psalms, a verse that says, I will be with him in trouble. And the Midrash here is suggesting that we put ashes in another paragraph we're not going to look at today, also on ourselves to show our repentance and our mourning for whatever it is that we've done to deserve to earn the calamity that we are facing. But by putting ashes also on the ark, we bring God into partnership with us. And Yehuda ben Pazi says we rely on this verse that says, right, I will be with him in trouble, seeing a partnership between us and God. And if we together have this partnership over the troubles that we face, right, that gives Yehuda ben Pazi the right to say, we're bringing God into this with us, and we do that symbolically by placing ashes on the ark. And of note, and what struck me was the response to this that Rabbi Zera brings, that I quoted also on the page here. Rabbi Zera says, at first when I saw the sages place burnt ashes upon the ark, my entire body trembled from the intensity of the event. When I read that the first time studying in this cycle of Daf Yomi, Rabbi Zera's statement also, caused me to tremble a little bit, actually, in a couple of ways. First, I thought about the way in which the fast day service and these changes that are being described, that we just reviewed a few of them, are meant in part to change the normal routine and to shock us a bit out of our normal practice, right? Something's wrong in the world if there's a drought. Something's wrong in the world if we're suffering from a plague. Something is wrong in the world. Business should not be as usual. Life is not as usual. So our ritual life changes, and we move out of our comfortable synagogue, our comfortable seats, the normal places where we gather together to sing and to pray. And the prayer has to look different. It's in the public square. There are ashes on ourselves on the ark, and some of that is meant to jar us, to shake us out of maybe our complacency. I imagine what Rabbi Zera must have felt, right? Picture the image for a minute, right? You're at an outdoor service at your synagogue in response to a calamity, and the ark, which you're used to praying in front of because it's part of the fixture of your synagogue sanctuary, is brought outside as well. And before they start, someone takes a bucket of ashes, right, and throws it on the ark. It's pretty jarring, right? The ark is something we keep clean, we protect, we don't, right, play around in, right? If you go in the middle of the week to take the Torah to roll it for like Hanukkah Torah reading, like we have to do this week, right? You're not going to bring your cup of coffee up into the ark because you don't want to spill, right? You're going to leave that outside when you go to do that non-service task. And even during the service, we approach very gingerly the ark. But here we're moving to a scenario where we're doing something jarring, so jarring that Rabbi Zera, who's familiar with all these routines, just the first time there's such a shock of the moment, that his whole body trembles at the intensity of it. The thought that, oh my God, we're going to throw ashes on the ark, it jarred him into a new place. So as I'm thinking about the calamities that we're facing in our day, my own personal theology isn't one that leads me to say we should declare communal fast in hopes that God will make changes to the world, because my theology doesn't allow for divine intervention to bring the rain or to cure disease. But I do think there is something about shocking us into a new state of awareness about what we're facing. We've seen in North America many people taking to the streets about climate change, about social injustices. Right? There are ways we do move out of our homes and out of the other places where our community gathers to cry out in the streets in face of the calamities that we see. More I think in our day in a protest sort of space than in a prayer sort of space. But I know many of the religious gatherings or gatherings that are convened by religious groups with Jews and our non-Jewish neighbors, right, include tefillah in those moments. And some of what those moments are meant to be are to shock us out of our comfort zone and say, there are some things that we can do to make changes. Right, our bodies should tremble, and we should think differently about the world that we're in when we're facing calamity, to try and say, what can we do differently to maybe help change the impact of this? And for me, that there's a real human element to this, because I don't think in my own theology that calling out to God to save us is going to help, which means we have to look to ourselves. And it's really making me question, our own responsibilities for changes in climate and what we're facing in terms of the suffering that's caused by new weather patterns that we know more and more it's human action that caused the conditions that lead to some of these changes. And even for the coronavirus pandemic that we're facing, as there's a potentially new spike coming this winter with new variants emerging, and countries are starting to shut down travel, I've done a lot of thinking about how that jars me and my experience. I have my Rabbi Zera moment thinking about, well, maybe we as people have set the conditions to allow viruses to spread faster because we so quickly get on a plane and travel across the country and travel across the world. And that maybe as a human species, by becoming a global village, we've made ourselves more susceptible to disease. That if we stayed more locally and traveled a little less, maybe we could protect our own viability by containing the spread of diseases. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist or a biologist, so I don't have the science to back that up, but I wonder, what are the ways that the calamities that we're facing shake us up? What are the ways that we need to dump ashes on things that we hold sacred or are part of our regular lives that we need to jar ourselves out of in order to look at the world through a different lens and hope that we can act and that our prayers will be answered and that the tough times that we're facing will change in the near future. So there are some thoughts about the Ta'anit section of fasting section of what we're going to talk about today. I see that while I've been speaking, the chat's been a little active, which is good. Want to open that up. Julie, is there some, I don't know if you've been following the chat. You're always so good at that, chap. Someone said, I'm an epidemiologist. The rabbi is correct. I love when, that's good. Every time I'm correct, call it out. You scientists and everybody else, I like to see that. But sorry, Julie, I asked you a question and I cut you off because I was excited by Yoshua, the epidemiologist.
Oh, yeah. Would you like me to ask a couple questions that came in through the chat box?
That'd be great. It looks so rich. If you've been following, I could use your help to direct us to some of the comments.
I have been. There was a question earlier when they're talking about the Ark. Are they talking about the Ark of the Covenant or a regular Torah Ark and scroll?
Nice. A clarifying question. No, they're talking about the Ark like we have in our synagogues, the Ark where the Torah scroll is kept, not the Ark of the Covenant. By the rabbinic times, already the Ark of, when these fasts were put into place, right, the Ark of the Covenant had already been lost to us in one of the various temple destructions, and the details of how that happened are lost in the fog of history. But they're definitely talking about the Ark like we have in our synagogues today.
And there was a question earlier as well. Why would public prayer be considered disgraceful?
I think some of that notion is it's disgraceful that it's not public prayer in and of itself. It's about some of the additional prayers that are added, which are talked about in other pages in the Masachet, where some of the notion of those prayers is that we have to own our sins that led to the status where we're suffering, and doing so publicly is the thing that's disgraceful. But a little different way, we have this in the liturgy of Yom Kippur, right? Part of in the Kol Nidre service, like we say, right, we're here. And we all acknowledge that we're going to pray amongst sinners, right? That we're acknowledging that we're a moment where sinners have come together to pray. Right? Yom Kippur, we do that though. It's a big day in Shul, right? It feels very public, but in theory, right, in our community that we're a part of, we don't take that the confession of sins out into the public square, into the streets. And I think there's a piece of like going out into the streets and putting on sackcloth and ashes and calling out to the heavens, right, making a more public spectacle of it, and is disgraceful in terms of just what the themes of the prayer is on the fast days.
I'll share one more comment from the chat box from Janine. Ta'anit 20, today's page, spoke about not depending on miracles.
Oh, yes. That is true. There's a lot of, as I've been reading and studying and writing about Masachet Ta'anit, and maybe it's a highlights of the book, for a different day, but there is a piece that the theology, there are different angles of the theology in different places, and the Talmud in its multivocal nature isn't always consistent. Right, on some level, some of the text is about, let's call out to God and ask for divine intervention, and like we hope the result of that is God will hear our prayers, God will forgive us, God will decide on the merits of our sages to bring rain, and all will be well. At the same time, there's a practical voice also that says, well, you can't depend on a miracle. Sometimes there's just going to be a drought, and that's what it is. And there are ways in which we can read those two statements to gel together, but sometimes you can also read them to reflect on different sorts of theologies, that sometimes we turn to God to save us, and sometimes we recognize, well, we can't depend on God to save us. Or, as I stated in my 20th century theology, maybe 21st century too, is that, I don't believe in divine intervention in that way, that God will save us in that way, which is that's a class for, I don't know, during the panel, it was like a year and a half ago, Julie, we started there, we did a theology piece where we dealt with that a little bit. Anyways, all right, there's such rich comments in the chat. I hope everybody's reading. I always feel bad in our quick half hour of highlights that if we had an hour and a half and we could all be sitting together around the table, this would be even richer discussion than it is in this format, but I'm glad everybody stuck with it a little bit. All right, I'm going to shift gears like the Talmud to something completely different, but I'm going to hopefully cycle back and connect them together. We're sitting in the middle of Hanukkah, and just a few days ago, the Talmud talked about a holiday that's connected to the events of Hanukkah. It happens to fall a few months from now, and it's not one that we keep as much anymore, but it appears on our page. Oh, hang on. I'm going to try to get it all on one page on my screen. I'm having there we go. And this is Nicanor's Day. I don't know if you've heard of Nicanor's Day. If you're reading the Daily Dose of Talmud, you encountered it on page, or you're reading Daf Yomi, you encountered it a couple pages ago, page 18 of Ta'anit, where Nicanor's Day is mentioned as a day when we're not allowed to fast. Right? Some of what Masechet Ta'anit is about is what we do when there are public fasts, but there's also a reference to a book called Megillat Ta'anit, the Scroll of Fasting, that happens. It's called the Scroll of Fasting, but it lists mostly the days when we don't fast. Maybe it's an ironic title, right? The fasting scroll tells us when you can't fast. So I guess if you're going to declare a fast, you got to check the fasting scroll to make sure you can fast. And one of the days the rabbi said we don't fast on is Nicanor's Day. And here's what the Talmud says about Nicanor. Nicanor was one of the generals in the Greek army, the Syrian Greek army, right? The army of affliction in the Hanukkah story. And each and every day he would wave his hand over Judea and Jerusalem and say, "When will this city fall into my hands, and I shall trample it?" So Nicanor gloats over Judea and Jerusalem and saying, "When will it come to pass that I will be victorious and I will conquer this city and knock it down?" This part will echo Hanukkah. When the Hasmonean monarchy overcame the Greeks and emerged victorious over them, they killed Nicanor. So be prepared, trigger alert, a little excessive Jewish violence. They cut off his thumbs and big toes and hung them on the gates of Jerusalem and said, "The mouth that spoke with pride and the hands that waved over Jerusalem, may vengeance be taken upon them." So Nicanor was a general in the Syrian Greek army after the story of Hanukkah. Antiochus has moved on, is no longer the emperor, and his successor has taken over. And while the Hasmoneans are no longer rebels fighting to keep the Syrian Greek army out, they're actually the ruling family, the ruling political force of Judea, which is an independent political area after the Hanukkah story. But the conflict between the Syrian Greeks and this new Hasmonean monarchy continues, and the books of Maccabees, which are historical tellings of the story of Hanukkah, both refer to battles that happen after the temple is recaptured and rededicated, which we're celebrating this week for Hanukkah. And this is one of those moments. Nicanor comes as a general of the Syrian Greeks, is sent back to try to retake Judea and Jerusalem. The Talmudic text shows him being prideful and overconfident. Like with the Hanukkah story, the Hasmoneans are victorious over his army. And here the Talmud says, because he was so boastful about what, with his words and what he would do with his hands and his actions, they cut off his thumbs and big toes and hung them on the gates of Jerusalem. I'm doing a personal rewatch of Game of Thrones. If you want to see images of what that looks like, Game of Thrones, not in Jerusalem, but there's plenty of that sort of gore on television. If you want to see a modern cinematographic, sorry, I'm not getting that word right, image of this, you can. I'd rather not, although it's on the show I'm watching. And we see this, and to celebrate the victory over the Syrian Greeks, again, Nicanor's Day, which falls on the 13th of Adar, which is the day before Purim, becomes a day that we can't declare one of these public fasts. So I mentioned this today because while it's not exactly the Hanukkah story, it's connected to the conflict between the Syrian Greeks and the Jews, which is what Hanukkah is about. I would encourage you, if you're interested in these sorts of things, to look up. You just have to go onto Sefaria and search for Nicanor, and you'll find references in both Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2 to this story. If you love Shakespearean epic dramas, the books of Maccabees have a much more detailed and Shakespearean sort of tale, in that this whole conflict starts with a former high priest who wants to regain his position in the temple, which he has lost to the Hasmoneans. And he travels off to the Syrian Greeks and tells them that the Jews are making trouble. And the new emperor sends Nicanor to fight, but Nicanor makes peace with Judah Maccabee instead of fighting, so that the former high priest has to go back and get the emperor to instigate battle, etc., etc. If high drama in Shakespeare, it reads like either a really complex soap opera or a miniseries, or maybe even a Shakespearean play. But if you want to know more about Nicanor's day, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2 are places to think about. So connecting this to what I said earlier, some of my reflections on the first text were about just my own thoughts about thinking about, how we face the calamities that we're facing today. And I wonder, Nicanor's day was a day we couldn't fast on, but stopped being celebrated by the time of the rabbinic period. It made me think about how, we're so used to the Jewish calendar and Jewish holidays being fixed, there was a time where they were more in flux. And I think about this a lot, what are the days where we might either have fast days or not have fast days based on our own Jewish historical experience. And what comes to mind for me is in my day, in my lifetime, in my experience, I always think we should be declaring a fast day on the yurtzeit of Yitzchak Rabin. To me, the tragedy of the assassination of Yitzchak Rabin parallels a day like Tzom Gedalia, which is a fast day that the rabbis had for another Jewish leader who was killed centuries ago. And that there's a notion that just like Nicanor's day came and went, that we should recognize the events, both happy and sad, that happened in our lifetime, and feel free to mark them and to make them Jewish days and to add them to the Jewish calendar, so that we have moments and space that reflect our own experience in the world and build them into the Jewish life cycle and routines. There would be a debate about Rabin's yurtzeit, should it be on the Jewish date or the Gregorian date, partly because the Rabin family, in part in response to the fact that he was assassinated by a religious Jewish person, marks the assassination of Yitzchak Rabin not by the Jewish calendar, by the secular calendar, as in some ways, I guess, a spiritual protest against the religious forces that led to the assassination. That'd be a different debate in our day, but I wonder what kind of Talmudic sugya that would look like as well. So anyways, happy Hanukkah, and a few months down the road, happy Yom Nicanor. I might see you between now and then. Steve is asking, was Purim a replacement for Nicanor's day? No, totally separate, connected because they fall in the same week. And actually, Nicanor's day fell on the day before Purim, which the rabbi said you're not supposed to fast, Over time, the day before Purim has become Ta'anit Esther. It's actually a day where we do fast now, having nothing to do with Nicanor and Nicanor's story. So Nicanor's story came and went, I guess, because there were a time when the events of the Hasmonean Empire and the conflicts, were really present in everyone's historical eyes and led to commemorations and celebration. And after some time passed by, they didn't feel as obligated to it, and it fell away. So there you go. Again, I feel I've unjustly given you the highlights of this week, or of this week's Daf Yomi, because there's 15 to 20 other texts I tagged with post-its in my Gemara, and so much more, because it's so rich. There's so much more, but here are a few that really jumped out of the page for me, and I hope you're taking something away again. And as Julie will tell you, we'll be back next week, right?